This, by the way, is the weakness of liberalism. You have all of these like neo-reactionary tough people, tough guys or whatever on the internet saying like liberalism has failed, and all these kind of hardcore conservatives or whatever saying liberalism has failed. No, liberalism has weakness. And its weakness is not necessarily being able to spot psychopathic linguistic manipulations.
I know, it's been a while. I just haven't had much to say. Not a lot going on right now. I could bagwagon on BS news stories for the sake of just making content. Weigh in on stuff like the man who wears a COVID mask while having sex. You know, even though his wife and him are already vaccinated, of course. Yet I'm kind of exhausted of all this culture war stuff. Also, I don't care about Israel-Palestine. I don't see why anyone would in the US. We had the biggest blow up in the conflict in decades. A couple hundred people died. Within 2 weeks it was over and we went back to the status quo. Whoop-de-friggin' do. You see, we've returned to the banality of neoliberalism. There's nobody to root for in politics anymore. All hope's been extinguished. Already they're planning to bring Paul Ryan back. Forget about Make America Great Again. 2024 looks like they're going to try and make the Republican Party libertarian again. Not the base sort of libertarian either. The kind whose number one campaign issue is lowering the capital gains tax. In other words, the news is boring. Batman versus Superman levels of boring. I might as well reinstall The Outer Worlds. So I've struggled to find anything to listen to right now, which led me to James Lindsay's YouTube channel. James Lindsay is an anti-woke, anti-postmodernist academic. He and some other academics became infamous for pranking SJW University journals. They submitted made-up woke academic articles, several which got published. One of them took portions of Mein Kampf and replaced the Jews with men. It got published in some feminist rag. Now that's pretty funny. I'm all for making a mockery of woke academics. That's not what I want to talk about though. James Lindsay is one of these people who gets lumped into this intellectual dark web, you know, alongside Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson. If you want to appeal to the hearts and minds of college students, you probably shouldn't call yourself the intellectual dark web. There may be a bit of a framing issue there. Likewise, I wouldn't name my political movement the Black Empire, the Intelligentsia of Inequity, or the Fascist Alliance. Let's say I'm someone on the fence of whether wokeness is good or bad. If the cabal of academics against wokeness identify themselves as some sort of bleak vision of society, why would I take them seriously? Regular people don't want to be like Darth Vader. They like things like hope and harmony. The critical race people ought to be the ones being framed as being dark. Anyways, James Lindsay does these 3-hour podcasts on things like Hegel's dialectics. Yeah, they're boring and pretentious. You're better off just listening to Kaiser from Fallout New Vegas.
How do I put this basically enough? It's a philosophical theory, the kind you might encounter if you took time to read some books.
Here's what all these podcasts pretty much boil down to. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, those guys are the heroes. The critical race theory people who are popular today, they're the supervillains. The civil rights movement isn't the same as the critical race theory. These principles contradict. It's therefore a subversion of civil rights.
So, does critical race theory continue the civil rights work of the movement of the 1960s? No, it does not. It absolutely does not.
You see, the civil rights movement was all about empowering individuals. Then these critical race people show up in the 70s. For purely nefarious reason, they abandoned this emphasis on individualism. Derek Bell is a Senator Palpatine-like figure. He turns the civil rights movement over to the dark side. You know, because he's evil. Real brilliant thought went into this. Now, before we go into the weeds, I need to make some things clear. I oppose critical race theory. I'm tired of this woke stuff. Like many of you, I'd like nothing more to have a white boy summer this year. That being said, James Lindsay's view on this issue has serious flaws. I'd say these flaws are shared across the entire intellectual dark web. The intellectual darkness may in fact due to be a shared lack of brain mass. One final thing before we get into it, let's get the timeline down. In the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement. In the 70s, Derek Bell, who once again I call Pookie, invented critical race theory. In the early 90s, CRT became popular in academia. Finally, around 2014, we had the Great Awakening. CRT became culturally culturally popular in society in general. Now here's the million-dollar question for you. Were black people better off as a group in the 1950s or the 1970s? It's obvious, isn't it, James? By nearly every metric, blacks were better off in the 50s. Employment, incarceration rate, intact families, income equality, victimization rate, business and home ownership. I'd go so far as to say that the civil rights movement was a disaster for black people. Now that doesn't mean every part of civil rights was bad. I think ending segregation did help black people in the South. Segregation may have worked if the South was half black, half white, yet blacks were less than 10% of the population. If you were a black living in Alabama and you wanted to, say, visit family in New Jersey, it would be very dangerous for you. If you stopped at the wrong gas station, you could be arrested or even shot. Ending segregation was definitely a good accomplishment, yet most of the gains of the Civil Rights Act ended up hurting, not helping black people. Now, James Lindsay might say something like the following: the Civil Rights Movement wasn't meant to help black people, it was a movement to expand individual rights. Okay, sure, you can take that position. However, that's pretty much the central premise of critical race theory. Let's say you signed up for Pookie's CRT class, back before he died. On the first day, he gets up on the podium and he drops a bombshell. The Civil Rights Movement, the one that everyone loves, with Martin Luther King Jr., it's all a fraud. It wasn't meant to help black people. Instead, it was a movement for the benefit of whites. So yeah, James Lindsay's framing just starts to unravel. The leaders of the Civil Rights Movement weren't heroes. They didn't help black people. They didn't, for the most part, make things better for them. If anything, they're the villains. I also don't think it's fair to treat Pookie or the CRT people like Senator Palpatine either. He didn't corrupt the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was already a failure. He was absolutely correct to abandon it and go back to the drawing board. Now, all this being said, is CRT succeeding where the Civil Rights Movement failed? No, it also appears to be a failure. After last year's riots, black people do not appear to be better off. In fact, crime rates have skyrocketed. It got so bad in Atlanta that the mayor refuses to even run for re-election. I mean, just look at some of the BLM demands. More welfare and reparations. Well, we got welfare as part of the original Civil Rights Movement. Didn't help black people then, why would it now? Is James Lindsay even correct that critical race theory isn't part of the Civil Rights Movement? Well, only if you believe that the purpose of civil rights was individual rights. If it's about the attempted betterment of black people, then yes, it is. CRT is the current iteration of civil rights. If you believe otherwise, you're basically agreeing with Pookie that civil rights' purpose was to benefit white elites. This is the distinction that the intellectual dark web loves to make. The 1960s civil rights movement was a liberal movement. Critical race theory isn't. Therefore, there must not be a relationship between the two. Sorry, I don't buy it. Not when so many people who support critical race theory are liberals. Sure, some BLM supporters are Marxists. That's why they use the communist fist. I don't believe Kamala Harris is a communist, though. Am I supposed to believe Mitt Romney is a hardcore Marxist? Pookie himself wasn't a socialist. His ideas wouldn't be popular with people like Joe Biden if he was. Like all liberals, most critical race theorists put individual rights as their first principle. Contrary to what James Lindsay says, equity is not their number one concern. They simply believe racism is an artificial barrier that stands between individual minorities and their goals. CRT is a way for governments and corporations to help these individual minorities. Only when systemic racism is limited can the individual be truly free. So what's the response to this? Well, someone like James Lindsay might say something along the lines of, a true liberal wouldn't rely on the government to help them pursue their individual interests. Oh really? Let's say I owned a restaurant. A black guy applies to work as a server. Sure, he's qualified for the job, yet I tell him I'd just rather hire a white. Would James Lindsay demand that the government intervene and either force my business to hire the black guy or otherwise shut it down? Without a doubt, he absolutely would. So there really isn't an ideological difference between him and the CRT supporters. The only difference is the CRT supporters believe in systemic racism in institutions. James Lindsay, meanwhile, thinks those claims are bogus. That's an empirical, not an ideological difference. So what's really going on with this whole intellectual dark web thing? It's not an alternative way of thinking about things. It's more like just a cope. Just listen to how desperate James Lindsay sounds here.
Neo-reactionary tough people, tough guys or whatever on the internet saying like liberalism has failed, and all these kind of hardcore conservatives or whatever saying liberalism has failed. No, liberalism has weakness.
In his podcast, James Lindsay frequently compares himself to the woke. He talks about how he's so much more successful and productive than they are. You see, he's worked on scientific projects. Meanwhile, the woke thought leaders don't produce much of value. Lindsay says this leads to their resentment, which then provides the fuel to the fire of woke ideology.
Their analysis can easily turn into that kind of curdled envy, that resentment that's building up within this group. The bourgeoisie is the seat of resentment in a society. And if you get too much resentment in a society, you're going to start tearing society apart with that resentment.
I can't help but wonder, though, if this all might be projection. Wokeism is popular. It's dominating each and every aspect of our society. James Lindsay's ideas aren't popular. That's why he's lumped into the intellectual dark web, like some sort of goblin. The future of liberalism is wokeism. It's not whatever James Lindsay and friends are offering. Perhaps that's why he's so resentful. Why else would someone do a 3-hour podcast on Hegel's dialectics? So how do we accomplish the betterment of black people? The problem with the civil rights movement is it just assumed empowering the individual would help blacks as a group. Black people use their individuality in many ways. They chose to take drugs, have sex out of wedlock, join street gangs, sacrifice education for a 1 in 50,000 chance of becoming a celebrity rapper. Sure, some black people made good choices and were very successful. Most made bad choices. CRT, on the other hand, assumes that eliminating systemic racism is the solution to help blacks. The problem is that racism isn't what's preventing black people from making the good choices. They just don't want to make those decisions. Therefore, CRT is not going to help black people. The problems that black people face in American society are cultural. That means you can't easily solve them by applying a political policy. The best we could do would not be to expand their individual choices. We'd be better off limiting the choices available to them. Hopefully then they'd be more likely to make the good choices like marriage and education. Of course, proposing something like this would be an absolute sacrilege to someone like James Lindsay. Social conservatism? I might as well be Mussolini to propose this. How dare I believe that not every problem can be solved by forcing a square peg through a round hole. We all know that libertarianism is the sacred path to salvation. It's not like moving across a rickety bridge over a canyon of hedonistic annihilation. You see, nobody in America can ever admit that liberalism isn't the solution to all problems. Bill Cosby dared to point out the truth, and look what happened to him. Sure, yeah, he probably did rape those women. It doesn't change the fact that the media's response to him was nothing but an ad hominem. Just because he did bad things doesn't mean the things that he was saying was wrong. Yet look at how he's treated compared to other questionable black celebrities. Mike Tyson, O.J. Simpson, Anthony Anderson. I doubt you'll ever see a black celebrity ever say anything like Bill Cosby did ever again. Most of the founding fathers agree that without virtue there cannot be true liberty. Our rights come not from the Constitution, they're given to us by God. Today's liberals don't understand the Constitution and they don't understand liberty. Doesn't matter if they're on the right or left. Don't trust anyone who says that maintaining a secular liberal democratic order is imperative no matter how scummy or immoral it's become. The intellectual dark web isn't going to be the institution that's going to save our society. If you enjoyed the video and you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please support small channels like mine by subscribing. Thanks.